how many of you weren't here for my talk yesterday morning? Okay, so several in fact, right here. Yesterday I was mainly talking about my books. Since several of you were not here, I am going to talk a little bit then about the books that I write before going on and talking about my own experiences as a writer to some small degree, then forming a reading from my latest book and moving on to questions and answers, if that sounds all right with everybody. So first of all, apologies to people who were here yesterday and who have heard some of this before. I write very strange books. Thank you very much. My first book, I did not expect to get published. I wrote it as something of an experiment. Well, my first published book. I had been encouraged by a friend of mine, Leanne Lassiter, to attempt a children's book, and so to a large extent, I went and seized a number of different things that I personally found fascinating, and wove them together with a large amount of whimsy and black humour. My first book, Fly By Night, is, as I've said before, best described as a sort of comedy fantasy, historical, spy thriller, crime caper, murder mystery. It's set in a world loosely based on the early 18th century in England, but also based on a number of other things that I found interesting. Inspired to a large part by a visit to Romania, and witnessing the sort of very different approach they have to their historic locations. With a lot of them, there's still a very raw sense of history with the wounds open. Things aren't as lacquered, as groomed, as carefully labelled. And I found this fascinating. So I think that very much influenced and informed the world that I created for Fly By Night. Somewhat perversely, I also created an alternative world that had no magic, nothing supernatural at all. It does, however, have a rogue printing press as one of its main villains, a homicidal goose, a mad duke, river battles, floating kite-drawn coffee houses, highwaymen, smugglers, and a murder mystery, hopefully enough to stop things getting dull. My second book, I seem to have written psychological and body horror for 10-year-olds. The premise, which hopefully starts off relatively innocuously, is that 3 children find themselves stranded somewhere that they're not really supposed to be, and in a moment of ingenuity, steal coins from a local wishing well and use it to pay their bus fare home. Unfortunately, the well itself is not what you'd call untenanted. There is something down there that now considers that the children have a responsibility to grant every wish associated with the coins that were initially cast down the well. There are a number of problems with this. One of them is that the well spirit is remarkably sinister and is trying to force a set of 12-year-olds to do this. The other problem is that the well spirit is not a people person. Her understanding of wishes and what people need, what people want, and what is good for them is shaky, and has become more shaky over the passing of the millennia. The other problem is that the powers that she gives the children are in many respects slightly sinister, somewhat embarrassing, a little on the dangerous side, and in the case of the leader of the children, dangerously addictive. They persist in trying to grant these wishes with increasingly sinister consequences. Now, the third book I've written is very different again. This is partly because whenever I finish a book, I loathe it with a passion that knows no bounds, and always want to write something completely different. So whilst I perfectly understand that as an author, the most sensible approach is to continue writing in the same vein and create a platform for myself which makes me easier to sell, this is in every respect not what I have done. Girlstruck Island is, as I described it yesterday, a sort of post-colonial political thriller for the 10-plus market in which some of the characters are volcanoes. This is set on an island 200 years after it's been colonised. There's been a lot of interbreeding, but there are still existent tensions, misunderstandings and frictions. It's also an island that's very difficult to travel around because of the number of volcanoes, I like volcanoes, over the island, the density of its jungles, and the fact that coral reefs and strong currents and storms make navigation around the coast extremely hard. So the island is very dependent upon certain individuals known as the lost, who are rare and are born with the ability to send their senses out of their body. So, for example, they can send their sight out to watch for storms, to watch for shoals of fish so that the fishermen know, or to hunt for fugitives and bandits over the hills. They can send their hearing out to the next village. And so they act as the communication system. They're the news system. It's understood that at a certain point, regularly, all of the lost in their different locations will be sending their hearing and sight to the news huts in other locations, so they can do a quick round and then inform their local community what's going on, of anything they need to know. So these people are essential. They are prized, and they are highly respected. And for once, this little poor village of a race that's very much become a distrusted underclass has a lost. Possibly. There's a young girl who's showing every signs of being a lost, or at least the familiar hallmarks. But it's not absolutely clear whether her tendency to kind of sort of not answer direct questions, behave as if she's not entirely in her own body, is because she's a lost, or because she's slightly backward. And this of course, this possibility is something that the village will do anything to stop people suspecting or guessing. And so this young girl has a minder, her slightly younger sister, whose job, as far as the whole of the village is concerned, is to look after her more important sister, and more importantly, to make sure the status of her older sister is never questioned, because the economic survival of this village depends upon it. Events and tensions erupt on Gulfstruck Island. Events overtake this village in a fairly catastrophic way, and these two young girls find themselves on the run, accused of something that they have not done. And I think I'll move on. My fourth book is a sequel to my first. It's set in the same mock 18th century world. Again, it's a world full of secret societies, backstabbing, and double crosses. I have double crosses, triple crosses, and at least one quadruple cross in the book. And as I mentioned to people yesterday, a midnight chase between different sets of people, all disguised as skeletal horses for complicated reasons. My fifth book is really weird, and I will be describing that in more detail in a little while, because I will be taking a reading from that. From this, courtesy of my beautiful assistant over there. As I mentioned yesterday, I have been writing crazed little stories for a very long time. Even when I was very young, a terribly shy little creature, apparently I would just come out of my shell just enough to burble mad little stories at people and then retreat back into my shell like some kind of dysfunctional hermit crab. My mother tells me about some 7-year-old being confronted with me and going, and then the monster, and going, she's full of stories, where did they come from? I used to tell stories to my sister when we were both trying to get to sleep, often serial form, so I think there may have been some continuity errors along the line due to one or the other of us falling asleep at key moments. But some of these were thrillers, some of these were chillers, some of these were comedy series involving families of dinosaurs. But this went on throughout our childhood. I wrote my first full-length work when I was 13 in a secret pad in pencil. It had spies in it they had names like Onyx and Amber. Let's just say that I do not think the literary canon has been robbed of a masterwork. And if it ever dug up as my juvenilia, I had better be dead. But I did learn from it. It was largely a kind of cliché risotto. It was full, inevitably, of all the things that intrigued me. But there were already some elements that I ended up carrying through. I already had a love of twists. I already had a love of anything that would pull the rug out from underneath the reader, get them to reevaluate people that they've been tricked into trusting. And yes, I was reading murder mysteries like crazy at this point. I was also addicted to the little black and white films that was always showed about 6 o'clock when we got back from school. The rather workman-like murder mysteries such as all the Thin Man films, the Saint films, the Falcon films, the Charlie Chan films, the Mr. Moto films, the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes films, both set in the past and in what was then the modern day. I adored these. They may also have influenced some of my sartorial choices. And I think that all of these sort of fed in. I didn't actually start submitting work until I was 16, when I had a burst of creativity for a somewhat odd reason. Now, when we are children, there always comes a point where we actually understand that we are going to die at some point. There is always a moment where you go from sort of knowing that to actually knowing it in a real visceral way. And for some reason, when I was 16, this happened. I can't remember if anything particularly sparked it off. I don't think anything did. And suddenly I was confronted with this reality that well, I couldn't fix through hard work, and I couldn't ask anyone else to fix with me. And my response to this was to write like fury. I think I don't think I'm alone in this. I don't think I'm the only person to respond to in this slightly bizarre way. But furthermore, I actually started sending it off. Now, submission, I have always found a terrifying process, because writing is like rearing a little goblin child, a little secret goblin child of your very own, particularly given the fundamental weirdness of my stories. And showing them is like exposing them to daylight without knowing if people are just going to up pitchforks. And there's always a temptation to think, well, I could work on them a little bit more, train them, make them more presentable, teach them not to bite the top off the ketchup, that sort of thing. So overcoming that and actually sending it, for me, as this incredibly shy young was a big deal. I did so and got some responses which were along the lines of, well, we're not going to publish this, but we thought about it for more than 3 microseconds, which was very encouraging. And so basically from that point, I was continually, when I had the chance and the momentum, continuing to write. During and after university, I joined a writers group, or founded a writers group, which galvanised my writing once again, because it had been sidelined in the way that such things easily are. Because for the first time I had a deadline. This is something that I have learnt. Many authors function different ways. I know that there are authors who have no difficulty with getting up at 6, working solidly for 3 hours, going for a brisk walk, coming back, eating while working for another 6 hours, etc. I function on panic and caffeine. I need to manufacture deadlines. This is doubly important while writing novels, because if your deadline is a year away, this doesn't work. So since that time, I have always tried to be a part of some writers' group of one sort or another. I'm currently in 2 that meet weekly. Fundamentally, it is extremely useful to me, not just from the feedback and community point of view, but just from the point of view of providing you with a deadline. Again, going and reading one's work at something of this sort, there is very much the feeling of, and now I produce my Goblin Child. And I distinctly remember going there with my first short story, and my hands actually shaking as I was reading it out to the other people who were in the room. And there being absolute silence, and me thinking, have they left? Are they asleep? We were in someone's student room. And at a certain point, there was a knock at the door, and there was a noise of annoyance around me all over, and I thought, oh, thank God they're listening. They're all still here. Now, I continued writing primarily adult short stories for some time. I had attempted longer novels on some occasions, some of which I completed simply because I felt it was important to complete them, but some of which I had aborted a certain way in after realising that there were some insurmountable problems that I'd encountered, all of which I learned from. At a certain point where I was working as a technical author and graphic designer for an IT company, I took on another writing project, which I was very much enjoying, more for fun than for practice than for any hope of producing anything worthwhile. This was an online communal narrative game. Because the people who were running it were very hands-off and very much expected people to create their own stories, there were an awful lot of people who were entering the game with characters, writing a small bit of text where their character walks in and they're going, and I felt desperately sorry for these people. So, despite the fact I wasn't really organising it, from inside the game, I started fleshing out the world around them and creating narratives for these people to run through and interact with, and ended up, as a consequence of this, producing quite a lot of text and having a lot of fun with this. As a consequence, a friend of mine, Rhiannon Lassiter, who was herself a published author, she's one of these annoyingly talented people who got published at the age of 19. Actually ended up reading quite a lot of my text and approached me and said, actually you're quite good. Have you considered, so would you consider working on a joint project with me? And I thought this sounded extremely interesting. So we agreed to start meeting each week and basically brainstorming, trying to work on a joint children's book. Until that point, I hadn't actually been, I'd been thinking of my stories as being for the adult market. But Rhiannon told me, your style and your subject matter, what you tend to write, actually suits children's literature rather better. So I thought, okay. And so we started meeting. And after a few meetings, it became very clear that our styles and our interests and our plot lines were totally different. And that in fact, they were completely incompatible. And what we had produced from our highly enthusiastic and enjoyable plotting sessions was two different book plans. So we decided that we were going to actually write these two different books ourselves, but continue meeting so that we could give each other feedback. And after I'd written 5 chapters, my friend Rhiannon told me that I should be submitting this to a publisher's. And I told her that she was wrong, this was dreadful, that I was only doing this for an experiment, and that I planned to bury this in an unmarked grave. So she poured a bottle and a half of wine down me, stole my chapters and took them to her editor. I am very, very grateful to Rhiannon. So my course to publication actually involved quite a few years of stubbornness and writing and rejection letters, followed by Rhiannon and a dollop of luck. However, getting to the point where my writing was of a good enough standard to actually remotely interest Rhiannon and her editor was a much longer story. there are a lot of things that I would tell younger me now if I could. And I think I'm not sure what I was quite expecting. When you're unpublished, publication sort of looks like the end. And then you reach that point. And don't get me wrong, it is wonderful, but the credits don't actually roll. You know, the next day the sun still comes up. There is still a world. Life goes on. Things I would tell myself. Right, all those doubts and insecurities. Get used to those, they don't go away. You just have them about different things. But yes, I was introduced to more of the mechanics of things, and in particular to the promotional side of things, which I had not known anything about. I hadn't even thought about it, and possibly rightly so. After the publication of my first book, one of the things they did was send me to America, and at the very start, I had a public speaking tutorial by this very nice American lady in New York, who basically told me that, well, of course, if you're talking to children, you're going to want to be telling them that, well, you know, their dreams can come true too. And oh, you don't ever want to be drinking from, if you're drinking water, make sure it's from a glass, not a plastic bottle, because that just looks tacky. And you're not going to be wanting to wear black. It's a bit depressing looking, and you'll sink into backgrounds. And of course, the hat will have to go. As you can see, these early attempts to recreate me were not an unmitigated success.
Not drinking from glass, then.
Sorry?
Not drinking from a glass, then.
Indeed. I have a confession to make, though. At a lot of the schools I have visited, I have drank from the bottle. Also, my focus has been less, your dreams can come true too, and more, let me read you something about a murder. Given the level of interest, I suspect my instinct may have been better than hers on that one. Things have shifted since then. Ideas on authorial promotion have become simultaneously more manic and more cleared up. They are less likely to try and rub the corners and peculiarities of authors, which is good because I don't think mine come off. Certainly it was interesting to attend an author branding course for a day this year. Not as dreadful as it sounds, partly because the people in question were actually authors, and therefore were giving us practical advice as opposed to being sales and marketing people. But one of the things they asked us to do is think of ourselves as a brand. You know, what is our brand? We had to think of 3 words that summed us up. For the record, I could be summed up by offbeat, adventure, and hat. I am 33% an inanimate object made of felt. So it's probably just as well I didn't actually discard this, otherwise I'd be diminished by a third. Well, I am now going to move on to a reading. This is from my most recent book, A Face Like Glass. Now, apologies to people that I described this to yesterday. The A Face Like Glass is set in Caverna, an underground city, which is a labyrinthine network of tunnels and passages and caves and chiseled halls. One that is notoriously hard to map, partly because it appears to disobey the formal rules of physics and geography. Its population is quite a large population, have never seen the sun. No one is allowed to leave, no one is allowed to enter. Stand outside. And most people in Caverna don't actually mind this at all. They're aware that there is an overground where there's no comforting roof above your head, and where there's this burny thing called the sun that can make your skin peel off. But as far as they're concerned, they're living in the only safe, sensible, and reasonable place. The outside world is extremely interesting in Caverna, on the other hand, because Caverna creates delicacies so miraculously exquisite and beautifully crafted that their effects are basically magical. You have perfumes that can fill the people around you with love or respect or fear, like a form of mind control. You have cheeses that give you visions, sometimes of the future, or explode if you haven't cultivated and tended them in exactly the right way. You have wines that can be used to manipulate your memory or the memory of others, to bring the face of a lost love vividly to mind, or to remove the entire memory of a book you've been reading so you can read it again with the same enjoyment. Or, of course, you can put in an enemy's wine if you wanted to forget the whole of the next year, the whole of the last year. These wines, though, have something of an impulse of their own, so have to be treated with a certain caution. And all these things are sold in tiny quantities to the outside world in exchange for all the food, water, provisions, and so forth that this underground city requires. There is one thing that the Cavernans do not have. They do not have natural expressions. For unknown reasons, babies do not imitate their parents' expressions in the same natural way that ours do. They do not smile back at their parents. Instead, in order to gain expressions, to basically acquire these in their repertoire, they need to be taught, slowly and painfully, by a professional. This does tend to mean that the number of expressions you have going through your life very much depends on the quality of creche you had as a very young child, which means that the poor, the very poor, have about 4 or 5. Most of them politely obedient or blank expressions, because why would you want your drudge class to have angry or rebellious or unhappy expressions? And then you have the rich, who will have several hundred expressions, and then the very rich, who can afford to hire professional face smiths to design them expressions for specific occasions, or to go with a particular outfit, or because they want to be, because they're engaged in a sort of one-upmanship with their neighbours. Sometimes a face smith will bring out an entire range of faces, which become all the rage for a while, so that all of the elite have to buy and learn these faces in order to try and drop them into conversation as naturally as possible. There is one exception, and she doesn't know it yet. There is a young girl who is discovered. Actually, no, I'm not going to explain this just yet. I'm going to move straight on to a reading. A little bit of explanation of the reading first. The court of Caverna, the elite, the place where the elite interact with each other, is not a pleasant place, which is perhaps unsurprising. Caverna is a city full of perfect liars. Every expression that anyone wears has been donned deliberately. Nothing is natural. It's always a choice, like putting on a hat. As a consequence, trust doesn't tend to get built up particularly easily. When you compound this with the fact that a lot of the people in Caverna have lived unnaturally long due to some of the unguents and ointments that can be used to extend their lives, what you have is a level of long-term plotting and backbiting that becomes increasingly dangerous. A particular cheese master named Grandable has got very tired of attempted assassinations and has given up on the whole of the court. He has retired away from the court of Caverna into his own private cheese tunnels. And, well, because his cheeses, dangerous as they are, don't try to kill him all the time. And has resigned himself to a solitary lifestyle. However, he gradually becomes aware that there's something else in the tunnels with him. And, after finding a footprint in one of his cheeses, he realizes that it's a young child. Bear with me. At night, Grandable would sometimes wake from superstitious dreams in which a whey-coloured imp with tiny feet pranced ahead of him, leaving tiny weightless footprints in the Stiltons and sage creams. Another month of this, and Grandable would have declared himself bewitched. However, before he could do so, the child proved itself quite mortal by falling into a vat of curdling Neverfell milk. Grandable had heard nothing untoward, for the creamy junket was already set enough to muffle the sound of the splash. Even when he was stooping over the vast vat, admiring the fine, slight gloss on the setting curds and the way they split cleanly like creme caramel when he's pushed his finger into the knuckle, he noticed nothing. Only when he was leaning over with his long curd knife, ready to start slicing the soft curds, did Grandable suddenly see a long, ragged rupture in their surface, filling with cloudy greenish whey. It was roughly in the shape of a small, spread-eagled human figure, and a row of thick, fat bubbles was squirming to the surface and bursting with a sag. He blinked at this strange phenomenon for several seconds before realizing what it had to mean. He cast aside his knife, snatched up a great wooden paddle, and pushed it deep into the pale ooze, then scooped and slopped the curds and whey, this way and that, until he felt a weight on the end. Bracing his knees against the vat, he heaved back on the handle like a fisherman hauling in a baby whale. The weight strained every joint in his body, but at last a figure appeared above the surface, shapeless and clotted with curds, and clinging to the paddle with all the limbs at its disposal. It tumbled out, sneezing, spluttering, and coughing a fine milky spray, while he collapsed beside it with a huff, breathless with the unexpected exertion. 6 or 7 years old, to judge by the height, but skinny as a whip. "How did you get in here?" he growled, once he had recovered his breath. It did not answer, but sat quivering like a guilty blancmange and staring from under pale, soupy eyelashes. He was an alarming enough sight for any child, he supposed. Grandable had long since abandoned any attempt to make himself fair and presentable in a way of which the court would approve. In fact, he had rebelled. He had deliberately forgotten most of the 200 faces he had been taught in infancy with everybody else. In his stubborn solitude, he wore the same expression, day in and out, like a slovenly overall, and never bothered to change it. Face 41, the badger in hibernation. A look of gruff interest that suited most situations well enough. He had worn that one expression so long that it had carved its lines into his features. His hair was grizzled and ragged. The hands that gripped the paddle were darkened and toughened by wax and oils, as if he were growing his own rind. Yes, there was reason enough for a child to look at him with fear, and perhaps it really was afraid. But this was probably nothing but an act. It had decided that terror was more likely to win him round. It would have chosen a suitable face from its supply, like a card from a deck. In Caverna, lies were an art, and everybody was an artist, even young children. I wonder what face it will be, Grandable thought, reaching for a bucket of water. Number 29, uncomprehending form before hound. Number 64, violet trembling in sudden shower. "Let's see you then," he muttered, and before the curled figure could react, he had thrown water across its face to wash away the worst of the curds. Long braided hair showed through the ooze. A girl then. She made a panicky attempt to bite him, showing a full set of milk teeth, with no gaps. Younger than he had thought at first then, 5 years old at most, but tall for her age. While she sneezed, spluttered and coughed, he grabbed her small chin and with a heavy rind brush began clearing the rest of the clogging Neverfell curds from her features. Then he snatched up a trap lantern and held it close to the small face. However, it was Grandable, not the child, who gave a noise of fear when at last he saw the countenance of his captain. He released her chin abruptly and recoiled until his back halted with a clunk against the vat from which he had saved her. The hand holding up his trap lantern shook violently, causing the little glowing fly trap within the lamp to snap its fine teeth fretfully. There was silence, but for the tallowy drip of curds from the child's long clogged braids and her muted snappers. He had forgotten how to look surprised. He was out of practice in changing his expression, but he could still feel that emotion, he discovered. Surprise, incredulity, a sort of horrified fascination, and then the heavy onslaught of pity. Thunder above, he muttered under his breath. For a moment more, he could only stare at the face his brush had revealed. Then he cleared his throat and tried to speak gently, or at least softly. "What is your name?" The child sucked her fingers warily and said nothing. "Where are your family? Father, mother?" His words had as much effect as coins dropped in mud. She stared, and stared, and shivered, and stared. "Where did you come from?" Only when he had asked her 100 such questions did she offer a whispered, hesitant response that was almost a sob. I don't know." And that was the only answer he could get from her. "How did you get in? Who sent you? Who do you belong to?" "I don't know." He believed her. She was alone, this child, this odd and terrible child. She was as alone as he was, more so than he, in fact, despite all his attempts to hide away. More so than a child that age could possibly realise. Suddenly it came to Grandable that he would adopt her. The decision seemed to make itself without asking him. For long years he had refused to take an apprentice, knowing that any underling would only seek to betray and replace him. This child, however, was a different matter. Tomorrow, he would organise a ceremony of apprenticeship with his strange young captive. He would invent a parentage for her. He would explain that she had been scarred during a cheese baking and had to keep her face bandaged. He would guide her pen to enter her name as Neverfell Grandable on the documents. But today, before anything else, he would send out for a small velvet pass. Thank you very much. Now, young Neverfell spends the next 7 years of her life cooped up in the cheese tunnels of Cheesemaster Grandable. And in all that time, he never allows her to step outside into Greater Caverna. Furthermore, any time a visitor comes to these tunnels, and there are some, there are errand boys and occasional messengers from the court, he insists that Neverfell wears a mask. She has no idea why. He doesn't keep mirrors around. She assumes that she must be hideously ugly, a not unreasonable assumption. She's not. The secret of Neverfell's face is that she's normal, or at least normal as we'd understand it. She has natural expressions. Her face actually shows what she's thinking and feeling in a way that is unique in Caverna. It is probably not revealing too much to say that attempts to confine her within the cheese tunnels are ultimately doomed, and she does blunder her way out into the wider Caverna. where her arrival is greeted with a mixture of fear, fascination, awe, and acquisitiveness. Because you have a lot of people in Caverna, particularly amongst the elite, who have lived for centuries and for whom even the miraculous novelties and delicacies that they are privileged to savour every day have started to pall. Life is losing its interest. But looking at Neverfell, with her intensely expressive face, they can start to see the world anew. They can vicariously experience the commonplace and the extraordinary alike, freshly, and as if they were still had that ingenuousness of the soul. There are many people in Caverna who therefore wish to own Neverfell. So, there are also some who look at her and see the potential and realise that she can be used in some of their long-term plans against each other. But there are others, figures from her forgotten past, who would very much like that past to remain forgotten. And these people are willing to kill her. So young Neverfell is in a position of trying to decide who she can trust in a city full of perfect lies. Now, I've been talking for some time, so I think I should probably throw things open at this point and ask if anyone has any questions.
Where did you get the idea of the cartographers?
Like the
Cartographers, yes, sorry.
Oh, yes. To explain to those of you who haven't read the book, as I previously mentioned, Caverna is notoriously difficult to map. This is partly because geography does not, in fact, obey the usual rules. It's not simply the fact that it involves trying to map in 3 dimensions. It's the parts of Caverna loop back on themselves. There are implications that Caverna herself is partly sentient, that there is something animate there, and that she is very interested in keeping her inhabitants within her, and that as the population increases, she is trying to find ways of expanding, ways that in some respects defy the literal confines of the mountain within which Caverna is actually contained. Cartographers are both necessary and dangerous, because to a certain extent they have succeeded in understanding Caverna and her geography. This takes a toll upon sanity. Cartographers tend to fall in love with the beauty of Caverna as they begin to understand it better. And they very much regard her as an individual, albeit a bizarre and monstrous one. They are dedicated to worshipping her with maps and, if possible, explaining the beauty of Caverna to others so that they too can enter the joy. You do not want to speak to a cartographer for more than 5 minutes. Otherwise, the next thing you know, you will be quite mad, running off through the labyrinthine tunnels, waving a sextant covered in butterflies. So basically, a lot of people will flee from cartographers if they see them, or will only speak with them if they actually have an hourglass on hand to keep track of how long that they've been talking to them, so that they know when to run. Absolutely essential for some of the more detailed, some of the more ambitious journeys, and for working out where you can reasonably start drilling or digging without hitting fire damp or anything like that, but very dangerous. I suspect that the cartographers actually come from my own disastrously poor sense of direction. As far as I am concerned, I live in a world where geography makes no sense, where roads shift and move around when I'm not looking at them, when landmarks act like pantomime bushes, and the moment I'm looking over there was good. So I'm quite happy to plunge the reader and the entire community of my book into my own personal world. They can suffer it too. As far as I'm concerned, maps don't describe the physical world. Maps are talismans you carry around to get the roads to stay still. Any more questions? Why cheese? I love cheese. I have, in general terms, an ardent, passionate, enthusiastic relationship with food. I've always loved cheese. I love it all the more now that I've gone vegetarian. And at that point, anything that could give me protein and iron developed this sort of celestial glow around it. It's one of the reasons why I could never go vegan, because they would take my cheese from my cold dead hand. Also, I just really liked the idea of cheese magic. I've even had the book occasionally described as cheese punk, which makes me very happy. I liked the oddity of that. Also, it gave me the excuse to go off and learn how to make cheese. Yes, it's research, it counts as work. I went off to a cheese-making course somewhere called the Yarna Trust, which, I don't know where it is now. But I think it was closer to this neck of the woods than home, so it took a long while to get there, but was well worth it. It was a day-long course, and we got to make a hard cheese, a soft cheese with little herbs in it, and mozzarella, which is huge amounts of fun. We also got to use milk that was still warm from the cow, which was really rather lovely. The hard cheeses we took back with us and attempted to rear. They became nicknamed Tubby and Leany because of their appearance, and because we'd, I think on the way back, we'd actually put one of them top of the other. So one of them kind of, and the other one kind of, we did eat them ultimately. I think they're very much a niche taste, I think. Yes. I wouldn't necessarily, not for all palates, possibly not even for ours. But mozzarella was fun, because as part of making it, you have to take it, and it's kind of, just after it's been taken from the hot way, and stretch it like that, and to play with it. That's part of it. You have to do that, and then make it into shapes. So it's got the joyous kind of Play-Doh element, and you end up with something you can eat. So that was a lot of fun, and it was work. Yes, no, you have to. It's part of it.
You have a character in Face Like Glass, which is basically seems like taking the expression "sleep with one eye open" and making it literal. Was that how that character was born, thinking of that expression?
It wasn't thinking specifically of that expression. To explain to those who haven't read the book, as I've mentioned before, the court of Caverna is not a safe place, and the leader of Caverna has been leader for about 500 years through extreme paranoia. His life has been extended through every arcane delicacy he can get his hands on, but he has ultimately decided that he can't afford to go to sleep, that any time he spends asleep will open up opportunities for his rivals and enemies. And so he has decided, basically, that he will go to sleep one brain lobe at a time. So half the time you have one half of his brain awake and the opposite half of his body awake. The other time you have the reverse occurring. These two personalities are not identical, as you might expect. They're not identical in their capabilities either. For example, one has considerably better grasp on language than the other. One of them, and another one is considerably better at pattern spotting in a rather more intuitive way that doesn't translate into the more analytical terms the other one favours in quite the same fashion. And there's certainly a sense in the book that these two halves have actually been diverging slightly and becoming increasingly suspicious and impatient of each other. But yes, the Grand Steward is a peculiar figure in the court, and because most people obviously can't see which lobe is asleep or awake, They can only see which side of his body is functional. And generally speaking, since he's staying quite still, what they notice is which eye is open. So they tend to get nicknames right eye and left eye. And things have reached a point where basically right eye and left eye actually have their own set of favourites at the court. So people's rank and ascendancy will differ quite substantially depending on the time of day. Actually, since we've got quite a lot of time, I could potentially give you a short reading referring to the Grand Steward. That does actually segue in fairly.
Do you need me to show you how to get back to the table of contents?
I think I'm getting there. Thanks, Barbara. When I start mewling faintly, the answer is yes. Wonderful. Thank you very much. You will now have to excuse me a short while. The Grand Steward was dying. There was nothing precisely wrong with his body. It was, in fact, unusually healthy and strong, though it had become strange over time. His heart beat slowly and steadily, strengthened by the juices of 100 carefully chosen herbs that flowed with his blood. No, the problem was his mind, or more accurately, his soul. Try as he might, he could not stop the life gradually seeping from it and leaving it greyly numb. His senses had never faded with age. On the contrary, over the years, he had used specific spices to sharpen them. He could gaze upon a particular deep shade of green and pick out every nuance of the colour. Zilupian fern green, his mind would inform him. Grey, said his soul. Just a shade of grey with a greenish name. His well-trained tongue could pick out every flavour of a sweetmeat. Honey from bees fed only cowslip nectar, his mind would tell him, with cherries marinated for 21 years in peach and saffron brandy. Ash, said his soul. Ash and dust. Even the continual battle to stay alive, to avoid assassination by the hungry and ambitious, no longer made him feel alive as it once had. The danger no longer gave him a thrill. The battle of wits offered no surge of the blood. Now there was only a cold and heavy dread that death would bring not release, but an eternity of greater monotony. That he would find himself trapped in a lifeless body, with a mind that was fading mote by mote, blind, deaf, dumb, numb, and powerless against the march of the grey. And yet, yesterday he had almost felt something. He had sat behind the crystal curtain of the waterfall, his sharp ears catching every sordid whisper at every table, each a tiresome scribble across the marble of his mind. Then the tedium had been broken. A goblet had been tipped over, and his attention had been dragged to the figure of a girl who had jumped to her feet as purple wine spread across the table before her. He could not now remember what she had looked like, but he remembered the torrent of feelings that had blazed, ached, and flickered across her face. Shock, guilt, regret, horror, self-consciousness. For a moment, he had almost remembered what it was like to feel those things. His mind had flinched from the flame of the real. And now the inquiry told him that this very girl had turned herself in at the gate. he would send for her. And perhaps he would find that her facial antics had all been a cunning piece of theatrics, a natural-looking montage of faces prepared by some clever facemen to impress and deceive everyone. Yes, yeah, it was probably so. Nothing in Caverna happened naturally or without planning. Despite this, as he waited in his marble-tiled reception chamber, he felt something sluggish stir in his soul. Something that in another heart might have been hope. Now, any more questions?
You mentioned earlier that you then started by writing short stories. Do you still write short stories, or have you gone completely novels?
I do sometimes still write short stories, yes. In fact, I've been writing a few more of those recently. I've had a few published in anthologies. There was one a couple of years ago that appeared in an anthology, a witches-themed anthology called Under My Hat, which featured a few little-known names like Neil Gaiman and Garth Nix. So it's actually a very good anthology. I started looking at it through interest and going, oh, this is really very good. Ended up reading it all. More recently, I appeared in a shorter anthology called Twisted Winter, which is a series of sinister winter-themed tales, which I was extremely excited about because there was a short story in it by one of my childhood heroes, Susan Cooper. I'm afraid at the point where I discovered that I was going to be in an anthology with Susan Cooper, I may have made noises so high-pitched that only bats could hear them and thrown all my papers around the room. So this makes me lastingly happy. I've also been producing a number of other short stories recently for an American editor called Jonathan Strahan, who was responsible for Under My Hat, and which will be appearing in magazines, both print and online, over the next year or so. I'm very much enjoying revisiting the form, and I'm hoping to do some more of this, even whilst continuing with the longer fiction. So, yes, the fact remains that actually a lot of the short stories that I write, and the longer fiction that I write, is not as different from what I'd be writing for adults as it might be, given that I don't tend to go graphic as a matter of personal style, and I tend to assume that children can cope with dark themes and relatively complicated, twisty plots. So actually, a lot of my short stories, the ones that I have already written, or the ones that I wrote in the past, are not as different from some of the short stories I'm writing now as they might be.
What do you think it is about the word punk that inspires people to add random nouns to it and create
I think it's because it's a really satisfying sounding word, punk. It has sort of rebellious and slightly cheeky and appeasingly onomatopoeic kind of sound. It sounds like somebody being punched with something humorous. So I think that's probably partly it. But yes, it's got that slightly sort of rebel rakish sound to it as well. And it's satisfying to say. So yeah, that would be my best guess.
I was just thinking of we've got all steampunk now and you mentioned cheese.
Yes.
And then cyberpunk before that.
Indeed.
What's the next punk genre now?
What's a
Cheese
punk?
punk has firmed its way
What
through.
would people like it to be?
Sinister punk.
Sorry?
Sinister punk.
Sinister punk. I think a lot of the existing punks already have elements of sinister. At least I would say in their better form. But now I seem to do weird things for genre. So if there's any particular punks that people would like, tell me now.
Wine-based, plonk punk.
I guess I've technically done a bit of that too, because there was this sort of wine-based magic for.
You're choosing wine punk.
Yes, indeed. Sorry? Yes, volcano punk, yes. It doesn't blow off the tongue quite as
Volk punk.
Sorry?
Volk punk.
Sorry?
Volk punk. VOLC. Volcano punk.
Volk punk, yes.
Where
I think that, that's
find
a
one
punk.
punk?
Sorry?
Where am I going to find one punk? Which book?
Well, A Face Like Glass, as well as having this sort of effectively cheese-based magic,
Yeah.
there is also wine. Wine is used to manipulate memories, either to bring them back with particularly vividly, or wipe them out. There is at least one character who uses strategic amnesia. In fact, ultimately there's two, but I won't go into that because that will involve spoilers. But yes, wine can be used in a very functional way. And in fact, do come up and show them. I can't say too much about this because it would give some spoilers about the end of the book, but I do need to show you this wonderful costume. This is actually a wine and cheese brooch, which I believe has been Frankenstein together.
Yes.
It's Caverna Catering. The only true delicacies. Ask about our world famous extreme wine and cheese parties. Signed liability waiver required. Never fell ground at all the diction.
This will make even more sense to those of you who read the book, in that it sort of refers to the end.
About Saxon, were you consciously influenced by Terry Pratchett, and why a goose?
Well, Saracen.
Saracen.
Sorry. Was I consciously influenced by Terry Pratchett? I see you mean in sort of luggage-like.
Yes.
Not consciously, no. Yes, there are some similarities, and they both are a massively destructive force of nature. So yes, comparisons I believe are entirely valid. As for why a goose, the short answer would be, the flippant answer I would occasionally give is basically, dogs are too slavish, cats lack loyalty, cows are hard to carry. But I wanted something that could feasibly be destructive, but at the same time be capable of being underestimated and still be funny. Geese waddle. And a lot of people looking at a goose will actually, particularly in that time period, will not be thinking tornado of destruction. They'll be thinking dinner. So I wanted something that a small girl could carry around without necessarily attracting immediate fear from anyone who hadn't met him. Also, if you have something like a cougar or a dog running around biting people, that's not funny. If you have a goose actually injuring people, it's still funny. The goose itself was also partly influenced by a goose owned by a friend of mine. It was called Jemima, a lovely little white thing, used to guard his back garden. Once broke a friend of his leg in 2 places. In the goose's defence, the goose had not been briefed on the fact that said friend was allowed to climb into the garden over the fence. It was only doing its job. What has been interesting is that since that book's been published, when I've been talking to other people, I've had a lot of people come forward and say, yes, a goose broke my wrist once. Like, oh yes, when I was a child, I encountered this goose, I had to have stitches in my face. So this was not an isolated incident.
There's actually, before I found the goose puppet for yesterday's thing, I was looking online for pictures of geese to try to figure out something to do. And if you look up attack goose as a phrase on Google Images, it'll bring up, there's this door with a huge sign on it saying, do not open door, geese will attack. You know, these geese standing outside. There's apparently this office where they actually have to sign up.
I have seen this picture.
Yes.
Yeah, it is very fun. It's all true.
So, having read your short story with puzzles on your website, is there any more, please?
What, more short stories or more puzzles?
Short stories with puzzles.
Oh, I'm glad you like that. I had lots of fun doing that together. Yeah, the website is made to do talented people who aren't me. I did write the short story, and I need to basically corner this talented young artist in Oxford and my webmaster and go, I want these crazy things, and they made them happen, which was very nice of them. I suppose I could try and do some more at some point or something, though possibly not on the website, since I suspect that would involve restructuring. But I'm glad you enjoyed that. Which ending did you pick?
Oh, well, I did both.
Oh, I think most people probably will. next question. Any more questions? What time are we on? Okay, we've got about another quarter of an hour. Are there any more questions at all? Or should I be rooting around for another reading, or should I be releasing you all?
No, it said it was only an hour today, so
Oh, is it?
yes,
Oh, in that
because
case,
it's
I've actually
Sunday.
overrun then,
Yeah,
haven't I?
just don't worry.
I
We're
am
quite
sorry
used to
about
that. Don't worry, we are quite used to that. So.
In that case, I should probably call a halt to that. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for the excellent questions. Thank you.